Hi, I'm Tasha Austin, host of Critical Conversations with NJTESOL-NJBE, where we counter anti-Black racism in language education, starting with ourselves. In this, Season 2, we invite experts to help push us forward in this goal. This month, we have Dr. Patricia Smith, Associate Professor of Language Literacy, Exceptional Education, and Physical Education at the University of South Florida College of Education. Thanks for joining us. Now let's have a critical conversation.
Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Critical Conversations with NJTESOL-NJBE. I'm your host, Tasha Austin, and we are here as always to counter anti-Black racism, starting with ourselves. We are in Season 2, and this is Episode 2, and I am controlling my emotions because I'm so excited to have Dr. Patricia Smith here with us. And what we're getting into really reflects not just Dr. Smith's amazing scholarship, but also the fact that she brings herself to her work. And so Dr. Smith, Patricia, however you prefer for me to address you, I'm going to let you introduce yourself, but I'm also going to ask that you let the folks know how you came to your amazing research agenda.
Thank you so much, Tasha, for having me. I'm so delighted to be here and just to have the chance to share. And like you said, to bring myself to the work with you and in conversation. It's just always such a blessing to be able to do that with Black sisters, with other people who are excited about this work. So I'm Patricia Smith, like you said, and I am Associate Professor at the University of South Florida, where I work on literacy studies and language education. I am primarily concerned with Black immigrants' literacies and Englishes. And when I speak of Black immigrants, I have worked with African populations, with Afro-Caribbean populations, but my work on race and language predominantly comes out of Afro-Caribbean students and Afro-Caribbean educators' experiences. And so you asked, how did I come to this work? I've got to say that since I was a little girl, I have been fascinated by language. I've always loved language. I still recall that my mother would say, go wash the dishes, and I would run under the bed and hide reading, while my siblings, who still remember this, would say, why don't you come help us? And so I would read, I read a lot, and I also noticed a lot in my village of Monrepo, which is a tiny village in St. Lucia, how a lot of the Creole language use was something that we were surrounded by in our little town, but that my father and my mother really wanted us to use what we call standardized English. And so we were never allowed to use the Creoles. We were never allowed to use what we call dialects in speaking. And we were expected to always improve our language to match that norm that was felt to be the better norm, the norm that would get us out of poverty, and the norm that would save us, right? And so even as a child, I was very aware of how I needed to sound and how I needed to say things. And so when I got to teacher training, my teacher training program in Trinidad and Tobago, my then mentor, Dr. Hyacinth McDowell, she said to me one day, Patricia, you will get nowhere using the word Smith as your name. So I said Smith because back home, we use a lot of the F as the pronunciation for TH. And she said, I've got to help you to practice this and get this out of your system. So I diligently was put through learning how to pronounce the TH in a way that would be acceptable and that I could sound that I was knowledgeable. And so I remember that specifically because it's come back full circle to me now that I have gone through the PhD program, and now that I have gone through all of this writing and learning about language and racial difference, and seeing how I had taught back in the Caribbean, and really getting to this space where I wanted to address some of these these kinds of norms that I had sanctioned back then in my teaching unknowingly. And I'm trying to help to bring this to the forefront in a way that is more explicit, in a way that's more intentional. And so in terms of coming to my research, I think that's kind of like the journey for me has always been that I have been fascinated by language. But the racialization piece I came to when I moved to the United States and understood the notions of Blackness and what that came to mean for me as a person and as a scholar and as a mother of a Black child. And all of these intersections really coming to bear on seeing the world really go through this racial tension recently with George Floyd and all of the surrounding pieces that extended globally as well. And really have enabled me to remain steadfast in thinking about this work.
All the chills, Patria. You want me to call you Patria or Dr. Smith?
Oh yeah, call me
Okay.
Patria by all means.
I like noted just some places of overlap that really, before we got on the call, well, before we began to record, you know, I just briefly said something about my orientation towards a diasporic kind of Blackness. And these are the reasons, right? So much of the shared experience has nothing to do with the geopolitical lines. I'm listening to you talk about what you were and were not allowed to say even within your home. And I had that very much coming from one side of my family, like, this is how you speak correctly.
There you go.
And the whole like speaking correctly so that you can climb out of poverty kind of thing. That was absolutely enforced in my upbringing, specifically more from one side of my family than the other. But then that last piece of how you yourself previously began to like sanction these norms as well.
Yes.
I definitely cringe at my like earlier practices in being a language educator. I taught Spanish in middle school and high school for a number of years, almost a decade. And it looked very different on my way out than it did when I began, because I thought that was my role, right? To help these kids the same way that the people who loved me tried to help me by getting me to tamp down. Yeah, I mean, so much of it is shared.
Now I'm getting chills.
It's that's why I'm so grateful. And it's also why like that piece of yours that, you know, I shared that I wanted to ask you about the focus on Black Caribbean immigrant educators, the piece, how does a Black person speak English beyond American language norms? In that piece, you specifically draw on world Englishes and a racial-linguistic perspective to disrupt naturalized and imperial monoglossic standard American English norms. And so in discussing what the participants did to counter these discriminatory pressures, you discuss the reclamation of English. And I feel like so much of that story you just shared of what brought you to this work, I can definitely see how it really is about this reclaiming in places where both you and I, and probably many Black diasporic people, were encouraged to depart from their ways of languaging. So what does reclamation of English look like for Black language users? And then how might that help us as an organization recruit and keep Black language professionals at NJTESOL-NJBE?
I'm so happy that you mentioned that piece, because working with these educators, getting through these stories, being able to analyze some of the things that they went through, it was so cathartic for me as a Black scholar, because I was able to start seeing so many nuances undergirding this. In response to your question, I think 3 of the words that came to mind around reclamation for me are agency, assertiveness, and authenticity, right? So what does it mean based on the experiences of these educators to be agentive as a Black language user? And how can being agentive allow for that process of reclamation? So I think back to one of the quotes from the article, which says that in much the same way that they had relegated their non-standardized Englishes to certain spaces within their home countries, the participants undertook a form of negotiation with themselves, determining which elements of their standardized Englishes that would remain central to certain spaces in their work and lives in the US. For instance, Devon, one of the participants in Sky, decided that they would maintain their patterns of pronunciation as well as vocabulary use. And these two educators, in addition to Kofi, another educator, decided to modify their ways of writing to meet academic expectations for tenure, despite the fact that they shouldn't have had to do that, as per Jonathan Rose and Nelson Flores, who talk about this in the racial-linguistic perspective. So I kept thinking, how do we foster and create spaces for that sense of agency for decision-making around both national and international Black language use at NJTESOL-NJBE? And how do we do this? By allowing professionals to maintain a sense of autonomy, right? So for example, one of the participants I had, Dana, she wanted to use standardized Englishes only in formal spaces. Do we tell someone like Dana, no, you must draw on your dialects in the formal space because we think it is part of the heteroglossic norm and it needs to be something you do in a formal space, right? Do we impose that on someone like Dana, right? And so that autonomy and that agency that every individual brings to language use, how do we preserve that? But at the same time, demonstrate that we are opening up the spaces for these individuals to be agentive as Black language users. And then how do our policies in the organization that govern the structures that we use to do business around language allow us to do this? Because it always boils back down to the policies that are being used to either create these spaces for agency and autonomy, or to clamp down on certain representations, right? And so these are the three questions that come to mind around agency. And the second one is assertiveness. How do we use that assertive component to engage in reclamation? How do we be assertive? Kofi, one of the excellent participants in the study with AERJ, he said, I explicitly address language difference in my classrooms by telling students at the beginning of the class about who I am and how I'm going to speak differently. So if they have issues, they can email me and I'll be happy to address their concerns or the issues that they're raising. Sky did the same thing, so did Devon. Whether it was to establish rapport, to facilitate communication, to guide instruction, or to scaffold students. There was this unapologetic nature of the participants to use language as a legitimate part of their instruction. And so I came to thinking for this conversation, how does how can NJTESOL-NJBE enable professionals to foster this assertiveness that allows them to use their languages unapologetically as a platform for translanguaging in classrooms, right? And so that is the kind of the second kind of disposition, being assertive and unapologetic about language use. And then the third one is authenticity, right? Being authentic. So Kofi never did change his way of using language in the United States when he migrated from Ghana. I loved Kofi's Kofi's way of presenting his story was very, very exciting because he kept saying, I'm not going to change. My students in K-12 can understand me. So by all means, if you are in graduate school, you can understand what I'm saying, you know, and so he placed a priority on maintaining his standardized Englishes and his accent as is in the new context of the US when he migrated. And so I asked myself, what does it look like for us at NJBE, NJTESOL and NJBE to have professionals use language like they do at home, whether that home is locally in the US or it's internationally in another country? How do we have them, be able to use language like they do at home in these spaces? What kind of spaces would those look like, and what policies would foster creation of those spaces? And then lastly, I know my response is a little long-winded, but
it's incredible.
Beyond the 3 A's above, I was thinking of Nelson Flores and Jonathan Rose's racial linguistic perspective, and the whole idea that the individual shouldn't have to bear this burden, right? So in the AERJ article, I talk about this whole idea of institutions and organizations using the experiences of these educators to decide about how we are going to operate and sanction Englishes that are standardized, that are not necessarily standard American English, right? And so what does it look like for NJBE, NJTESOL to have professionals use language, to have professionals be able to legitimize all the standardized Englishes that are present, and then of course other languages as well?
My brain is just all over the place. I starting with the fact that you call them standardized Englishes.
Yes.
I could just sit in that for a while, right? Because I so appreciate like the deep theory of it, because I realize that the translanguaging is deeply rooted in this like crossing borders all the time. Like, let's forget about the borders, and the way that you do that through plurality, it really, it shifts everything. You stop talking about things as a singular. It's languages, it's languages. Yes, that is amazing to me. And I have all my little notes here: agency, assertiveness, authenticity. Like, this is so, so helpful, and I deeply appreciate it. And it brings me to my second question that really gets deep into the notion of like what tensions this might bring up, right? Whereas we're thinking about, again, these invented borders because they're linguistic, but they're also geopolitical. And oftentimes folks think about the Black, right, singular experience as opposed to Black experiences and diasporic experiences. And it can sometimes cause ruptures and tensions among folks who share a lot of the way that they navigate the world. It's in an anti-Black world, right? And so the question I have is, what do you believe or see professionally as a researcher as the role of language standardization in schools? And that's in terms of dividing or unifying a Black diasporic possibility. And is this desirable anyway?
I really like Black diasporic possibility. It sounds so futuristic. Let me just say that. But great question, Tasha. Great question. I think that in thinking of this question, I really was compelled to remember the article recently published by Ofelia Garcia. It is the manifesto titled Rejecting Abyssal Thinking in the Language and Education of Racialized Bilinguals. And this article, or the manifesto, called us to reject ways of viewing our language as racialized, bilingual, multilingual people through lenses that have been created and sanctioned for so long through colonial rule. And so if you go back to my article, the AERJP's How Does a Black Person Speak English?, which presented indications about how certain people of color who are often bilingual and multilingual can in fact adhere to language standardization for certain purposes, given the belief that it is for greater good, then we see that there are different kinds of ways that we as Black people can decide to either internalize some of these ways of using language that have been imposed upon us. And then there are others of us who may decide, well, we're going to use another pathway completely, right? And so the article showed some Blacks illustrating their versatility with language and how it can work for education. And we have seen that as a result of colonization, even within the Black population across the diaspora, there remains this divisiveness, right? Coming out of a lot of these ideological, untapped racial-linguistic sorts of ways of using language that are often unattended to. And so I asked myself, how does racialized language, right, function as a marker of distinction within the Black race, and therefore perpetuates a lot of this divisiveness? How does the racialization of language actually contribute to that? When we think about these distinctions, we think that they occur within as well as across languages, or what we often refer to as dialects, right? For example, let's think about marked divisions among Black people who think of themselves as primarily Spanish speakers, whatever that means, right? And Black people who speak predominantly English but are not viewed as legitimate enough despite their use of Spanish. I think of marked divisions among African-American English speakers and Afro-Caribbean English speakers, marked divisions among Afro-Caribbean and African English multilingual speakers. And this is really not restricted to academia, right? This is coming out of emerging pockets. I follow these conversations, blogs, podcasts, discourse, commentary, articles in the media about how these divisive pockets are being maintained among the lay public, whether it's here in the United States or even beyond. And so they've been solidified, and also, as you mentioned earlier, politicized, right? So how do we identify, Tasha, is my question. How do we identify, acknowledge, and address these intralinguistic and intra-racial language distinctions, whether it's standardized or non-standardized language use among Black people? And so that brings me to probably trying to answer your question a bit more directly. I think unity is definitely desirable, right? And I think even critical across the Black diaspora. Schools do have a role to play in fostering students, Black students' agency, assertiveness, and authenticity with language, as well as to teach Black students how to engage with linguistic Blackness legitimately in ways that can bring about this unity. For NJTESOL-NJBE, we cannot, though, assume that a unity that is largely absent across the Black diaspora when it comes to racialization of Black language by Black people, whether it's standardized language or not, is going to, we cannot assume that that unity is present and that it's going to help us to move beyond the current tensions that we face. And so I think this is actually one of the greatest threats to our unity across the diaspora, this lack of attention to the divisive pockets that are steeped in racial-linguistic sorts of ideologies that have been internalized by individuals across the Black diaspora. And in order for us to unify and to use schools as vehicles for racial-linguistic justice, I think we must be willing to acknowledge these tensions and to intentionally, in spaces like NJBE and NJTESOL, create intentional spaces where we can have some solidarity across these groups.
That is amazing. That is absolutely amazing. And I'm saying that because when you accurately locate this responsibility as being within
Yes.
Black diasporic communities and without, right?
Yes.
Because if we're thinking about divisive ideological origins, that began from the outside,
Oh,
but
it
has
definitely did.
permeated. And so now we've got this, two front kind of fight that we're fighting. And it really is helpful when we acknowledge, it makes me think of the culturally sustaining pedagogies and the notion from Paris and Alim that you should not assume that in order to maintain what these young people have within the space, that they are going to be all knowledgeable about
That's
their
it.
histories and their languages.
Mhm.
And so that is your responsibility to also
Mhm.
be seeking the knowledge
Mhm.
as you invite it into, because I've seen that it's a slick move. I've seen that too, where it's like, oh yeah, trans language, do whatever you need to do.
That's it. Mhm.
Right?
Mhm.
Like, oh
Mhm.
yeah, your culture is great. Why don't you teach me? No, 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 no. It's not my responsibility as a
Yeah.
7-year-old, a 12-year-old, a 19-year-old, a 22-year-old to have that as I enter the space. So I'm so grateful that you said that. It really like helps me to solidify my thinking on it as well. I'm shifting now to the piece that, and I'm just going to go ahead and be blunt. Can I tell you that I was given this literature, your piece on characterizing competing tensions in Black immigrant literacies, from my amazing advisor, Dr. Cheryl McLean.
Oh, that's
And when
amazing.
it was given to me, it was given to me in my qualifying exam.
Wow.
And I was like, my brain just exploded, right? Because I'm like, you gotta do this right now. But I was
Wow.
grateful for it though, because it offered with such humanizing nuance what it is to occupy a space that is erased on so many levels. Um, and I'm just going to ask the question because this is going to be a 3-hour podcast, because I could just really tell you the impact that just one piece that you co-authored really had on me. But in that article, you draw from PISA data and you do a case study with a young biracial Jamaican young woman, and you discuss the challenges that Darcy faced because of her racialization within the United States context. But you also signal her meta awareness of
Yes.
that racialization, despite these different categories of erasure as non-native or native, Black versus Black American, African American. And so the question becomes, how can NJTESOL-NJBE ensure that our policies are expansive yet specific enough for the plurality of Blackness?
These are such powerful questions, Tasha. Let me tell you, I mean, I am so grateful that you have come to this with such powerful questions, because I think they're not just questions for me, but also for us, right? As a field of language and literacy, also just thinking about these questions really, I think, can do us a lot of good. So I think I started off in part, getting to that plurality piece that you talk about here. There is really a lot, I think, to be done in terms of how we conceptualize linguistic Blackness. When we refer to Black language, often in our minds, there's a specific language use that we're actually referring to, right? By a specific Black person that comes to our minds, whoever we are. When we hear Black language, we've got to start thinking, what comes to mind and what do we mean by Black language, right? I think there are 3 steps that can be taken when it comes to thinking about the plurality and how we address the plurality. We can call them the 3 Ds, since I did the 3 A's earlier. So the first one I came up with was de-essentializing linguistic Blackness, right? De-essentializing linguistic Blackness. And the second one is democratizing Blackness in general. Democratizing Blackness in general. And then the third one is de-silencing undocumented Blackness, right? So these 3 Ds came to mind. I kept thinking to myself, what would it look like for NJTESOL-NJBE to focus on these 3 Ds, right? The first step with de-essentializing linguistic Blackness, I kept thinking about this whole idea of naming the variations in linguistic Blackness that actually have presented themselves to us thus far over time. Because we do have somewhere to start, right? But if we are not naming these variations and we're not naming what they look like, it's going to be difficult for us to keep them in mind when we are attending to linguistic Blackness in our organization. So creating spaces, secondly, within discussion procedures as an organization that relate to these naming practices that we've adopted. And so that allow us to think of various representations of Blackness as we go through normal conversations. You know how as organizations we get off target very quickly. So if we don't have a list of the namings in front of us, we just say, okay, she's Black, she can do this, right? But we've got to be thinking intentionally in our discussions around policy making for the organization or just simply everyday business about including Black people in the creation of policies that advocate for these various namings. So how do we have multiple kinds of Black people is what I call that. But also if we can't get multiple kinds of Black people, how do we get a kind of Black person that, like you said earlier, is always thinking about Black diasporic possibilities, Black diasporic ways of being that gets that person to pull in these voices at the lower levels, perhaps, of the organization, so that they might be thinking about Black Spanish-speaking Americans, Black English and Spanish-speaking Americans, Black immigrants, Spanish-speaking. So having them have that disposition and coming to the table as leaders in the organization with that disposition, or creating more spaces to have various types of linguistic Blackness show up, is a way to handle that first step. And then I'm thinking about democratizing Blackness, right? Just in general, when we think about Blackness, we often think, okay, here's a specific person that I'm referring to. We have a lot of West Indian folks who do not consider themselves to be Black, but then when they get here, they are Black, but they don't still fit, they think, into the Black population. How do we navigate that democratization of Blackness? By first creating spaces to talk about Blackness, right? And then also by creating opportunities for various individuals to have a chance to represent their Blackness in spaces within NJTESOL-NJBE. So the Black global majority has to be foregrounded in a conversation like this, right? The Black global majority simply has to do with the fact that we've got quite a lot of Black people across the world. And so if we want to become an organization that sort of really looks at Blackness from multiple perspectives, being able to take that international sort of look, both here in the US and beyond, gets us to be thinking a bit more broadly about what we refer to when we talk about Blackness. And then the last one for this question, I was thinking about de-silencing undocumented Blackness. We have so many individuals who either have a friend or a family member, or who either are themselves undocumented, and they are on the periphery. Basically, their linguistic Blackness is now complicated by this illegality that they're experiencing, and but they have a lot, so much to offer, because being on the periphery means that you are neither here nor there, and so you are grappling with so much in terms of how you are experiencing racialized language, that you've got a lot to bring to the table. So how do we tap into that as a way of pushing back against those colonial sort of vestiges that we've inherited, and really undoing some of that illegality in terms of how we envision people among us who are humans, right? And who do not deserve to be characterized in ways that are dehumanizing based on nation state kinds of ways of being.
I think the chills I just got, because I have to like determine which chills belong to which part of what Patricia just said. I think those specific chills really struck me because of, I think it was just in maybe the final quarter of last year, that horrible image that was circulating of the Texas Border Patrol rounding up Haitians at the border. And I was looking for the outcry.
And I did not see it.
I did not see it. And I did not see it from a number of very like visible, like immigration advocates. Mm-hmm. And so that extra layer of invisibility really, really is disturbing, especially we're in NJTESOL, we're in New Jersey, we have a huge Haitian population. So watching like statements go out from the governor about what would be done for ex-refugees from X part of the world, and then complete silence in terms of let's welcome these quote refugees. They're migrants like anyone else is a migrant, but refugees is this language that they use, but complete silence. So I think those specific chills were connected to what you just brought up there. And it does bring me to this final question, which for me is something that I rage against constantly, but your brilliance and your specificity in this space in the scholarship, I feel like is just so desperately needed, particularly right now and in NJTESOL-NJBE with trying to better understand diasporic Blackness and how we can do better for these populations. And so the question is about West African and Caribbean Black immigrants who have been called new model minorities, right? Which is what you address in your piece. And they're called that for their economic and academic success as compared to their Black American counterparts. And so if we as an organization seek to center Black voices, how do we reconcile with what seems to be very different Black voices?
Again, another powerful question. I think, and very timely too, you know, because I mentioned some of it earlier. And for those people who know my work, I'm pretty sure I've talked about this quite a bit. As a Black immigrant coming from the Caribbean, where it's predominantly English speaking, it's easy to have individuals say, well, you know, you come from an English speaking country, and therefore, how should you know the realities of immigrants? But I think that being in this sort of privileged position and getting to the US and having this model minority status placed on Black immigrants, it behooves those of us who have that status to complicate it, right? And so I think that's kind of where I came from when I started talking through some of that model minority myth, which tends to be applied to Asian Americans. But you think about some of the recent literature that we've been seeing and just how Black immigrants are being positioned in opposition to African Americans. And I kept thinking this is quite a foundation for a lot of the divisiveness that we are maintaining, right, in the United States. And so I'll go back to just kind of backtrack a little bit to your question, to the Reading Research Quarterly piece, where I talked in characterizing competing tensions in Black immigrant literacies and beyond partial representations of success. I talk a little bit about the notion of success that we use, right? So I'll start here with this notion of success that we use to determine who does well and who becomes a person in society, right? In literacy and language circles, we have long since used these ways of thinking and being, as well as in other spaces. But these definitions of success are very much a part of schools, right? In the academy, elsewhere, this is a concept that is still around. For those of us who push back on the model minority myth, I think we do so and we think that, okay, we are exempt from using that definition of success because we belong to the group that's maybe disenfranchised, right? But I argue that we all subscribe to this myth, right? This intentionally or not. And the reason I say this, Tasha, is because when we decide that it is great for a child to go to Yale, but not so great for them to attend a community college after high school, we inadvertently subscribe to this notion of success. When those of us who are academics decide, I really want to get a tenure position, and if we do not get that tenure position, we think that, oh my goodness, all is lost. Or when we do, and we get tenure, we pursue tenure, we are excited that this is the holy grail, right? And we probably might be better than instructors, at least some of us think so. I am arguing that in doing so, we do subscribe to these notions of success. And so my first response to this question is less focused on the type of Blackness that tends to be ascribed model minority status, because the myth that undergirds that that my model minority notion is based on notions of success that we tend not to actually address, but that are deeply entrenched in Eurocentric norms. And so the picture that I would like us to think of is a bigger picture at first, right? A picture that is based on what is the notion of success that we have perpetuated or that we continue to perpetuate, right? And so to focus on the populations without actually focusing on these notions of success that are steeped in these Eurocentric norms causes us to be distracted from the foundation of the problem to its symptoms. And so if we are focused on its symptoms, then we spend a lot of time thinking that Asian Americans are the bad people because they are the ones getting the better stuff, or Black immigrants are the bad people because they're the ones coming and take our things. And instead, what we should be thinking about is the foundation of these myths that have been around for so long and that are being perpetuated and that are causing us to think that we are not also buying into these notions of success. However, I must also still address the fact that, the whole idea of Blackness being immigrant and therefore better is something that we as Black immigrants must take responsibility for. So my first point does not mean that the second point does not matter, right? I think the first point has to do with us coming to the recognition of the foundation of the problem. And then the second point is, as an individual working within the system now, how do I take responsibility for understanding that the model minority myth is coming out of this Eurocentric sort of space, and therefore for me to buy into it does not necessarily allow me to fulfill the goals of racial linguistic justice, right? And so if we think about the earlier comments I made about de-essentializing linguistic Blackness and being intentional about democratizing Blackness, we think about how intentionally naming and bridging these divisions has to be something that organizations create spaces for. Because all individuals, let's be honest, who are Black may not necessarily be at that level or that place where they are ready and willing to have these kinds of conversations, right? But at the same time, if we do not engage intentionally in these conversations, these divisive sorts of ways of thinking around Blackness will not disappear, right? Individuals who are coming from, whether it's the Caribbean or Africa, who think that their status is better because perhaps African Americans don't work hard enough. I mean, these are very, very terrible ways of thinking about another group of people who are also as Black as you, but who basically are coming to the table with the same Blackness that is basically rejected by Eurocentric ways of being and knowing that are imposed on us. So the myth of the model minority is one that we've got to engage with, I think, intentionally when it comes to Black immigrants and African Americans working together. In the International Literacy Association's Literacy Today, I recently published a piece called 5 Steps to Address Anti-Blackness. And in there, I talk about some of these points that I've made here today, which is the whole idea of thinking about how anti-Blackness is perpetuated across the diaspora and creating a better sense in our minds globally about how this has been perpetuated more covertly in literacy and language practices beyond the United States, even though we don't often see the overt kinds of racialization that's happening here, it's still taking place. And a lot of my emerging research, it's coming out of the Caribbean context. I argue for looking at how that racialization is actually occurring over there. So in there, I talk about 5 steps for creating local global connections in the ILA article. And I'm inviting, NJBE, NJTESOL to think about how we can bridge these intralinguistic, intraracial kinds of gaps, which are so critical for building the solidarity that we need across the Black diaspora?
Beast. I have to listen. I have to use my whole linguistic repertoire. That's my Jersey City, like North Tri-State beast. You are an absolute beast. That's first. I just have to say that.
I'm glad it's making sense, because this, as I mentioned earlier, this stuff is just being something that I've lived, and yeah, it's definitely, I think, so important for us to address it as a field.
My orientation is very much in Black feminist thought, and I just can't stress enough how experience as a criterion for meaning, Patricia Hill Collins, it means something. And this is why I always ask first, how did you enter the work? But I can see even in your scholarship that you bring yourself fully to your work, and it makes a difference. And it's not that other folks don't, but they won't acknowledge it, right? And so then you obscure your positionality with feigning this objectivity, like, things just pop up decontextualized. So I just so appreciate how you center that, because it just adds to the depth, the nuance, the clarity, the impact of what you're doing. The second thing is, I want to publicly apologize to my committee. When I got this article thrown at me in my quals, I was like, why did they do this to me? So this is a public apology. Dr. Patricia Smith.
I'm pretty sure that and Cheryl McLean is a wonderful scholar, lovely colleague. I'm so happy to hear that she's recommended the piece.
I could not be grateful enough, because encountering your work when I did is really important to build me foundationally as I really get deeper into my own work, because now I know that there is this. I say this to Uju Anya often: if it weren't for your work, I wouldn't have a leg to stand on. So it means so much to me. And the third thing I wanted to say is shout out to Dr. Rosa and Dr. Flores, because they are movable in their attention to the racial logics. And that's why I'm so attached to their work, because I realize how important it is to stop engaging the symptoms and get to the logics. And
they have challenged us to do that. And I will add to your shout out. I do this everywhere I can. And I've told Nelson Flores this before. You gave me a language to think about my experiences. You gave me a language to think about my research. And so I think it's phenomenal what they've been able to do. H. Samuel Lim, Geneva Smitherman, the whole project around racial linguistic justice, Ophelia Garcia. I think it's just phenomenal that we are at this place, and reading the Abyssal Thinking Manifesto was like, boom. So I just thought, wow, this is amazing. What a great time to be part of the work, Tasha.
That's what it feels like. It feels like, chills again. It feels like I'm stepping into a community, which is really nice. It's really nice to feel like I'm not doing this independently. It means everything. I look forward to reading the 5 steps to address. I haven't gotten to it yet, so I jotted it down. But I just want to thank you for your time. I know between this incredible grant, all of your scholarship, I know that you're super busy. So your time today is deeply valued. And I just hope that as we share it out, because it is an internal work to the organization, I hope that folks can see themselves in what you shared with us today, and that it advances their work as well.
I'm so excited, and I'm so grateful to you, Tasha, for inviting me here. I'm grateful to the exceptional Black leaders who have come before us, whose shoulders we're standing on to do this work. And I'm excited for what we're going to do in the future.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining us. I'm your host, Tasha Austin, and we'll see you next time.